tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai. Hara mai ki Hika. Kia ora tātou, welcome to this episode of Hika. This week, we're really privileged. We've got Liz Harte. Liz is a innovator, a visionary, someone with real compassion, particularly for our tamariki across our whānau and across our communities. She also has the honour of being my cousin. And so it's a real pleasure to have her on today on Hika. Te tuakana, nau mai hara mai ki Hika. E honere nōku ki te mihi atu ki a koe. Kia ora e te tuakana. Welcome to our program today.
Kia ora. Thanks, Hirini. Always been a cheeky and favoured cousin at all our whānau occasions over the years. And kia ora, thanks for having me.
Kia ora. So, cousins. So, my grandfather, Henare Tipi Whenua, and your grandmother, Emere Waiwaha...
Emere Mākere Waiwahaka.
Emere Mākere Waiwaha. I knew I was missing a name in there. We're brother and sister, and had a very close relationship, as all the siblings did. So it's a pleasure, to be here with you today, and also to maintain those connections and to share about this kaupapa. And so this kaupapa today, we're talking about your mahi with tūpuna parenting. I'll say tūpuna because I love that northern pronunciation, as everyone knows. And I... tūpuna parenting. So, how did you get into this mahi? What led you into it?
Tūpuna parenting, I acknowledge that, I could always hear the Ngāti Porou whānau saying, it's tīpuna, Lizzie, it's tīpuna, kia roha mai. I got into this mahi because of Mum, Helen Mountain Harte. She was a lead researcher in the space of traditional pre-colonial Māori parenting towards the end of her career, and of course worked along your dad, Uncle Hone, but also their cousin, Auntie Cooney, Professor Cooney Jenkins. And together they were advocates for Māori child welfare, for tamariki well-being in that era of near glassy and the anti-smacking law reform and all that was going through in that time. And so during that era, Mum and Auntie Cooney were doing research about pre-colonial Māori parenting, and they published a seminal report in 2011 called Traditional Māori Parenting that's now highly regarded and highly referenced. So during that time, I didn't have my tamariki yet. I was still a bit young for it, but I knew that the mahi that they were doing and knew it was important would help out Mum in little ways. And every now and then she'd be pulling together a presentation saying, Now Lizzie, look at this. You see this tāne, this is the dad, and he's got the pepi on his back in the carrier and the piko, and she'd be explaining little things to me, and I'd be like, oh yeah, that's interesting, Mum, and then go off and do whatever I'm doing. But when I had my tamariki, and it's first-time parent and all the rest, it's so hard, and so much harder than you think it's going to be. And then suddenly Mum's mahi clicked a bit more, and I was kind of like, let's talk about this a bit more, Mum. Let's actually, I'd like to learn some of this stuff. And we started having practical kōrero about, kāinga, the village coming in to help. And it took us on a journey that in 2018, we ended up starting doing some mahi together. So her mātauranga, I come from a tech background. So software developer by trade, spent 12 years in the tech sector. And so I was the tech and she was the mātauranga. And together we started this kaupapa together, though at the time we came up with our own name, Pepi Pena Pena, which the idea was meant to be that we should cherish and nurture and invest in our pepi. And it's really, it was really simple back then, and we were having early kōrero and early meetings with people, but I was also learning heaps, and we were writing up mātauranga and going through that traditional Māori parenting report section by section and really pulling it apart and talking about the relevance of it to bring bits of that into whānau today. Mum sadly passed away in 2019. She had breast cancer, and so it'd been a big journey over many years, and it is what it is. And I took the rest of that year to grieve and to settle on that, but also to try and decide what to do with the kaupapa. My tāne and I got hapu with our third pepi at late in 2019, and so 2020 was going to be maternity leave. And so I thought, this will be an opportunity to pick up this wero and try something. Now, everyone's got their COVID story, and this is part of us. Is our number 3 was born 2 weeks before level 4 lockdown. Level 4 lockdown, of course, happens, and then I'm like, but what about my plan? I had this great plan that we were going to, do these kōrero and online, but also start to do whānau wānanga and things like that. And so ended up deciding to do the online videos anyway, if only to practice sharing the stuff myself. Practice this kōrero coming out of my waha. Because Mum and I had done bits and pieces of videos and trying things out for kōrero and stuff, but it was mostly her doing the mātauranga. But it all kind of worked out. I ended up doing a big pivot to do professional development online instead of doing whānau wānanga a kanohi, which in that COVID era made sense. And it has, and with a lot of support from lots of wonderful people, including your good self, couldn't have gotten to where we are now without all of that, but it was a step-by-step journey, and that pivot ended up being what really changed and grew the kaupapa into the movement and the force that it is today. Hi.
Kia ora. It's a beautiful journey, and also one of the more useful uses of COVID lockdown, as opposed to I bought a deep fryer and lots of alcohol, and that was how I used COVID, is a lot of people's story, an air fryer. Also, just to acknowledge early in that journey too, cousin Anton, who was the first guest on this show as well. So, and the amazing work he was doing in there too with Auntie Ellen and Auntie Kuni and Dad and others. So, and so you're sharing these messages about parenting with an online audience, and our people were online in massive numbers, during COVID in particular, and still are. And you're using this amazing mātauranga, these revelations, insights that your mum and Auntie Kuni and others had kind of come up with and developed, and sharing that. If I'm always fascinated, Liz, with though the kind of life not led. You underplay your involvement in the tech sector, I think, because you did a degree in engineering, right? Which is, don't shrug like that. That's bloody amazing. It's like probably the hardest undergrad degree you could do, at university, and you thrived there, and you have this amazing engineer's mind of kind of problem solving, and I've admired watching you do this, mahi, as you view it as, here's the challenge, and, really systematically how you think about it, and God, your love of feedback. I hate feedback unless it's brilliant, so you're just, the way you approach this as an engineer is brilliant. Though we have something in common, like we both grew up in, kind of privileged backgrounds. We were the little princes and princesses. Really, we had very comfortable lives, very privileged lives. We didn't want for anything. We had international travel experiences. We had, everything we needed, really. You could have gone on and just gone after the money. You wouldn't have been short of it either. What obviously your mum's work, and, you describe it as taking up the kaupapa, but, what kind of drove you to do that, to make that decision, beyond just kind of finishing what your mum started? And I can really relate to that with Dad. But also for you, what were you seeing around you that kind of thought, I need to do this? I need to do this, mahi.
Kia ora. Aye. The staying, if I'd stayed in corporate, I could see the ladder. I was climbing the ladder. I'd gone from desk software engineer through to team lead through to project manager, and could see a pathway forward and beyond. Of course, with that tech sector portai on, I always envisioned that I'd probably have a startup one day. A lot of tech people do envision that. I guess that for me, I perhaps never envisioned that the startup might be kaupapa Māori, grounded in mātauranga and all the rest. But so that was one element of it, is that there is a pride and a joy and a passion for building your own thing, even if it's hard. And like you say, I with a problem-solving mind, every problem can be unpicked with careful thought. But it was also about the gap, because when I was Googling and looking at, who's sharing this mātauranga, is it, who's out there that's, sharing about the tapu and the mana of Pepe and Tamariki, that's sharing that our tupuna didn't smack, and it was considered really abhorrent to do so, that they saw their Pepe and Tamariki as little people right from when they were small, and would listen to them and include them, even in big hui with rangatira in attendance, chiefs in attendance. And I couldn't see, just from doing the Google and from asking lightly around, anyone who was focused on this kaupapa. And our people need it. I could see how important that work was, that Mum and, of course, Anton and Uncle Hone and Auntie Kuni had done for all those years. And despite all the mahi they had done, they still hadn't managed to trigger the widespread knowledge of this. If you ask a whānau about pre-colonial Māori parenting, they probably don't know. And I think for me, that's the North Star thing, is even if you're not changing how you parent yet, even just knowing that our tupuna, before the British came, parented gently and respectfully, and that it was a whole whānau affair to raise Pepe and Tamariki, not the nuclear, so on and so on and so on, that even that knowing and believing would be enough to slowly move many, many changes. Minute for a marathon. It's not a quick bit of work to try and share this mātauranga in lots of different ways, make it really useful and relevant for whānau today. But I want to try. I want to try, and so do all the people in Mairopu, and so do all those who have joined our kaupapa and joined the movement. We say that all our graduates of our Ngāko Aroha journey are leaders in their rohe. We encourage them to share it however they want, however they can, because that's the most important thing, is just that first phase, that awareness, that knowing. And change is in there too, trying to support and inspire and empower change, but you can't do that without the knowing and without the awareness and without the wider support. Aye.
Ora. Seeing the challenge and then understanding how to begin to address it, and the scale of the challenge too. So in terms of this mātauranga that you're sharing, and we've talked a little about where it's come from. So one strand of that is that tupuna parenting, the movement, is about decolonisation. So tell me about that. What are we thinking about when we're saying it's decolonisation for parenting? What does that mean?
I think if we look at wider te ao Māori, there's been lots of reclamation journeys, whether it's of moko kauai, or whether it's of rongoa, whether it's of maramataka, matariki, all these wonderful ways that our people are reclaiming our whakapapa and re-indigenising these different spaces. And those are terms that we use in this space as well. A lot of whānau don't know, perhaps, that parenting ways, parenting practices and strategies is something to decolonise, is something to reflect on and think about and question, well, why do I do this that way? why does my whakapapa do things that, how far back does this, it changed. Something changed back here. And before that, the rangahau, the research and the mātauranga all says, we used to parent differently. We used to do it differently then. And so we inspire and encourage the kaimahi who join our professional journey or whānau who join our wānanga. We inspire and encourage them to think, well, look back to those ways. And what of those ways would you like to bring forward? What's going to support you in your whānau journey here? What can be useful and beneficial for you and your whānau? And and so when we talk about decolonisation, it's as much about reclaiming whakapapa and re-indigenising parenting ways. And so depending on the audience, we'll swap out the kupu. Because not decolonisation as a term doesn't gel with everyone, but it is getting whānau today to consider that how they are raising their pepe and tamariki might be something to consider decolonising, and that they can choose if there's, they can choose, and they can also choose if they haven't within their own whakapapa line, they can't find pūrākau or stories that connect back to those ways. Kapai, you can be the first tupuna to parent in this way for your whakapapa, and you can generate that change forward.
Yeah, so decolonisation, that consciousness raising, that we don't have to be this way. We've learnt to be this. We've been taught to be this way reasonably recently. Like the violence inherent in our educational system, like, I mean, old enough to remember corporal punishment. I'm sure you are too at school, but not even just that. Like as kids, you're told to sit there in your chairs, shut up. You're empty vessels. You're to listen and to let. It doesn't matter what you bring in the classroom. In fact, what you bring in can be a disadvantage, need to be removed from you, like our reo, like our mātauranga often was. And, just the sheer violence in those classrooms. The violence, too, against our mātauranga, again, told it was worthless, useless. And then we take that home and we start living that out. Oh, well, this must be the way you do it. Kids, you shut up because I'm the teacher here. I have the power. You have no power. You shut up. You do as you're told. Otherwise, I'll use violence to suppress you. I mean, we internalised, what we were getting for, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so this process of saying to them, actually, we don't have to be that way. That wasn't ever our way. Yeah, and the revelation, I mean, I've experienced that of whānau coming to that realisation of like, wow, yeah, that's right. We didn't have to be like this. Incredibly, I know you're a sci-fi fan and we won't go into too much detail because we don't want to put people to sleep with you. But like, it's like when the aliens appear, right? That like, whoa, and so being told, having this deep knowledge, this deep rangahau research shared with you is so transformative, right? And then the other parts, and I like the way you're thinking about it. It doesn't all have to be decolonisation, as in it doesn't have to focus on the problem. It can be more about, let's talk more about the solution. And so if the solution is about bringing concepts, deep concepts like mana and tapu back into the whānau, back into your relationships with children, with each other, with everyone around you, what does that mean? How did you, I know for you, probably for us, it was, a bit of a journey to kind of discover that ourselves. We weren't just teaching it, we were kind of thinking, wow, that's an interesting way of thinking about something I'd seen. We were giving language in some ways to these concepts that we kind of knew of. How did you deal with that kind of encounter with these ideas yourself?
I think it's been a really special and important part of this journey with this kaupapa is to put words to situations and examples and experiences that we knew of, that I knew of, that we'd heard of growing up. And so I think being able to explain those things and actually explain them in a te ao Māori way. I think that's been really important. We're talking about, if we're acknowledging the tapu that we're born with, that we've inherited from our tūpuna, acknowledging that in our pepe and tamariki is to protect them, is to love them, is to connect with them, but also connect them with their community, connect them with the ngahere, the environment, connect them with te ao. And I think being able to explain that when we grew up with that, so we grew up, like you say, we grew up with, in our respective homes with our beautiful parents in our lives. Of course, not everything was perfect, but such is life. But being able to describe that that's what our parents were doing for us. They were taking us to whānau hui or taking us to marae events or explaining te ao to us, listening to us, kōrero with us, and it was all of that was them acknowledging and protecting our tapu and enhancing and supporting our own mana, which of course comes from our tapu. And so I think that's been, for me and for us when we were, like you say, talking through these values and how they apply to parenting and whānau relationships. And a lot of it's in the report as well, of course, the traditional Māori parenting report that Mum and Auntie Kuni did. That was the crux of it. And just choosing tapu and mana, of course, was kind of intentional. Because, of course, there's other values that we could speak about as well. You could talk about mauri, you could talk about wairua, ihi, wehi, wana. But I think in terms of if we're focusing on that awareness and making this something that's really useful and tangible and practical for whānau to think about and use every day, we just picked the tūpau, tapu and mana, and like pāhena re tates mahi, which really just grounds in those key values, that if you have a strong understanding of those, then you really understand the why our tupuna treated their pepe and tamariki the way they did. It really links in well and makes it really clear and makes it make sense. And then, there's a journey that whānau and the kaimahi who join our other journey can go on to, go back to your whānau hapu iwi and kōrero with them about tapu and mana and what that means to them. And whatever whakaaro they have to share and whatever are kōrero around other values, they can then get those, because every whānau hapu iwi has their own definitions of this stuff and their own way of thinking about it and their own context to consider and their own...
They do, but ours is right.
Yeah.
That's the difference. I'm so proud, overly proud, of that painting. It's Robin Kaukua original painting of Ranginui Papa Tunuku me Ruaumoko. And, from this story comes our tapu. We're descended from Ngā Atua, from Te Orokoanga, from creation. We're connected to every living thing, and maunga, rocks, humanity, birds. We're all part of that whakapapa. We all have that tapu, especially in humanity. And, we can learn about these things, in a wānanga kind of form. We can sit in a class and do it as a whiteboard. Your grandparents, so Auntie Emily, ran away from home because her father was an interesting man and had plans for her that she didn't agree with. And her being a Ngāti Porou, wahine poa, she said, I'm not going with those plans. So ran off to Dunedin, became a nurse, amazing. Rotorua, ended up in the north and met this very handsome young man, Walter Mountain, and they, it's a beautiful love story. And also, the best way she could get back at her father was, of course, to marry a Ngāpuhi. So, the win was hers all the way through there. And, remember, going up to Harte, as children, absolutely one of the most beautiful spot in the world. And Uncle Walter, he was gruff and not, he was lovely, not gruff in an angry way, but just, didn't speak a lot, particularly to us. And, I remember him in his singlet and but he'd take us fishing, and we caught so many fish. It was just unbelievable. Every time we put the line in, he pulled out a fish. It was just amazing. And he's sitting there. And you had similar experiences, right? With him and with Auntie Emily in her own way. And they were, I'm thinking about that in terms of, tapu and mana, like Uncle Walter, how he exhibited it, lived it, taught us. I mean, we're lucky we're old enough to have experienced that old generation firsthand, right? The ones who grew up on the whenua. That's a real blessing, I think, in our lives. But, that learning, I mean, you got experiences like that, with our parents, obviously, but, going up to the Hafti and connecting and, thinking about these ideas of tapu and mana with, like Uncle Walter and Auntie Emily.
Absolutely. So, Nan and Gramps. Yeah, of course, they lived for my whole life. They lived at Tarawhiti. And I remember Mum telling us, of course, before Mum and Dad had us, there wasn't even a road up there. So they used to have to get the boat all the way from wherever. And then they drive the tractor over the rocks to get up to Te Tawa, to the bay where their whare was. And it's the same bay where Grandpa's mum, Nani Nārino, had lived. And it was gifted to her from her dad. And so it's real whakapapa whenua stuff. It's beautiful. And yeah, so the summers going up there, it was the school would finish, up north we'd go, Christmas in the Rāwhiti, spend all summer there. Nanny was softly spoken, always came across as endlessly wise, endlessly kind, patient. My brother and I, we were the youngest of the mokopuna, so they're done moko and moko and moko, and so then we're the noisy stragglers running around with the hooks. But yeah, she was always patient with all of her moko and would listen to us and answer questions and explain what's going on. So always very kind and patient in that regard. And like you say, Grandpa didn't have many words, but that also meant that when he spoke, you listened. And they were both gentle. Nanny Liz reiterates, Mum's sister reiterates that they never smacked. They were always gentle hands with their tamariki, with all of their moko. And we absolutely saw that too, that gentleness, but still having time for us. It was kind of Grandpa's taking the tractor down to get the boat, and it was no bother for him that all of us kids would all climb on the back as well for a ride down to the beach. I mean, it's just there, but it was still a ride on the tractor.
Yeah.
And if all the luckies, if there's too many ducks or whatever, but he'd give us the chores to go and feed them and how to call them and all the rest. And he was, he'd give us responsibilities, but make them games. And so we didn't really think much of it. We were being helpful by going to shovel up horse poo so then he could mix it into the veggie patch kind of thing. And we thought it was great fun that we were going, okay, Grandpa, we'll go do that. Of course it's a stinky ass job. No one really wants to do it, but because he asked, because he wanted our help and because we wanted to be helpful, and he made it a bit of a game, saying, oh, don't breathe in, and da-da-da-da. And so we run off to, anyway. It was beautiful times, beautiful memories. One of my last memories and yes, of course, we had the fishing trips as well, except I get motion sick. So I was better for Burley than I was for that helps with catching the fish, I'm sure. But, I didn't go out for as many trips as others. One of my last memories with Grandpa, when he was starting to really slow down, the walking stick and all the rest, is he used to go for a little walk from the deck. He'd go down one driveway, along the verge, and back up the other driveway. And when he was starting to get a bit more wobbly with that, one of us would always go with him. And the last time I did that little walk with him, a little pikai waka, little fantails flitting around at our toes. And he pauses and he says, do you know why it's down there, why it's in front of us while we walk? And I was like, no. And he's like, it's because our feet are turning up the bugs, and so it's eating all the little bugs that we turn up, and so it's going to follow us along as we walk because we're giving it a kai. It's just a simple memory, but it was also really special. And it speaks to the kind of grandparents they were for their whole lives. That they would take that time, took 30 seconds. Yes, I was doing the walk with him and there was other general chatting going on, but take the time to teach, take the time for something for him that was, he'd known his for a long time and was obvious, but it's important to make sure the moko know this too. Little lessons, but a lot in that interaction, right? Yeah, it was wonderful.
And they were both in their late 90s when they passed, eh?
Yeah, 96. Nanny was 96, and I think Grandpa was, early 90s as well.
Early 90s, they're fantastic ages. I just, at the time we're living our lives with them, we're blessed at the times. Of course, we don't necessarily appreciate it because we're only, tamariki, and we're still learning life and what's valuable, and we don't have a sense of loss yet, hopefully. And yet, now we've got this language that we can think about it, and we might have applied it at the time. Maybe we're doing it also for kind of, because it's a teaching way of thinking, but, living out tapu and mana and looking back and thinking, what did they in fact treat us like we were people of mana, with tapu? I think yes. Did they acknowledge our tapu and our mana? Yes. Did they enhance that? Yes. Did they restore that if it needed to be? Yes. Beautiful. They didn't, look down on us. They didn't degrade us, diminish us, because, and why not? Because they should have. They probably could have. The system told them to, and yet they didn't. Such strong, powerful that mātauranga, and we might be, I'm sure if we sat down with Uncle Walter and said, oh, Uncle, I'm, Pops, you were doing mana and tapu, he'd be like, what a stupid thing, but we know what, he'd probably deep down, align with it.
Absolutely.
So, beautiful those lived experiences of this, and that's being able to pass that on to share that, with whānau must be so rewarding now as well with the program.
Absolutely. And I think sharing big stories and big pūrākau from whānau and whakapapa, but also sharing the little ones as well, like going for that walk with Grandpa and about the pikai waka, it's also reminding the whānau who come on this waka that, even those little memories, there's a lot in them, where someone's sitting, and you get a lot from them because they role modelled so much for us. They might not have told us, oh, I'm growing your mana right now by telling you this thing, but they were enhancing your mana or protecting your tapu through the interactions, and they were role modelling what that looked like. And so from how they spoke and what they did is as much where we can get the lessons to bring into our own whānau and whakapapa. One of the kaimahi on one of our journeys said, we're talking through this whānau pūrākau stuff and whatever, and she's like, my nan just popped in my head. We used to go over to Nan's house, and if we were ever starting to get a bit rowdy or, annoyed at each other, she'd send us all outside to play. And at the time, I didn't even think about it. Now, as a parent, I'm like, that's actually a really smart idea. Change of scene, getting out into the ngahere, getting a bit of space and a bit of air is a really simple way. So she didn't tell us off for being frustrated or shouty at each other. she gave us a change of scene. And that simple recollection for this kaimahi, she's like, I'm going to keep that in mind for when my tamariki start getting scratchy. It might be time to go out on the driveway or time to get out in the garden or something. Let's go do something different. A change of scene is required. And that's a simple pūrākau, but a really lovely one. So we encourage all of the attendees on any of our kaupapa, to reflect back. But also, if you are lucky enough, which we are, of course, unlucky now, but if you are lucky enough to have your parents or grandparents still with you, ask them about their grandparents. What do they remember? It's like a window into the past, ne? About, asking a kuia or a koro, what do you remember about your kuia and koro? So special. And I think everyone should do it if they can.
And sadly now, people are going to ask us, because we're that, our newest famous Australian, Jacinda, it was great. But remember during lockdown, she's talking about be kind, because people might be listening to this thinking, well, these are just, it's just kindness and common sense. But I think it is really important to think about the framing of this, just those little tiny moments. But if you start adding those up, they lead to, because, your nan, your koro, acknowledge your tapu and your mana, and they want to constantly enhance that. That's why they're doing these little acts. It's why you get someone a cup of tea. It's because you acknowledge, not just they're thirsty, they might not be, but you want to acknowledge who they are and what they bring and how you can do your part to uphold that. And powerful, just that reframing, rethinking of what that becomes, even of our own stories, right? I think not to be dismissed, but, it needs to be thought about. And, it's just brilliant to hear these whānau having the opportunity to kind of, think through their own stories. Unfortunately, though, far too many of our whānau also have great pain, trauma, loss, pain they've inflicted on one another. I mean, I see, Nia Glassie's whānau have been in the media again recently and seeking release, probation, bringing back those terrible, nightmarish pain that she had that killed her. Far too many of our whānau look back and just see anger and, pain and, well, my koro just used to give me a hiding and diminish me and, so how do you kind of deal with that, whānau who can't find those, empowering stories about acknowledgement of mana and tapu?
Kia ora.
Must come across it.
Every time. Every rōpū, there will always be some difficult stories. The main whakaaro we kind of have is that you do need to, of course, acknowledge that then. Acknowledge it. It happened. It was there. We ask some whānau to, look, it might not be your parents then or your grandparents directly who you could draw on for inspiration from your whānau hapu iwi. It might be aunties. It might be kaumātua at the marae. It might be others who are in your wider circle that you can draw on, because from a whakapapa standpoint, the tupuna would be the same. If we're talking about whakapapa lines. Some people are even more disconnected than that, and so they don't have those stories to draw on. And so we say that we have such a wide range of mātauranga, of European academic evidence, the European explorers at the time who saw our people and saw how differently our parenting ways were. And they were so different that they wrote about them in books and letters. They wrote about it lots, which means it must have been really different to how Europeans parented at the time, ne? But because of all of that mātauranga and all of that evidence, then we say to whānau, well, you can assume that your tupuna parented in this way. You may not have those stories or those experiences, you know, the acknowledgement of tapu and mana through your whakapapa lines may have changed, may have been somewhat lost, but you can reconnect. You can draw on that, reclaim that whakapapa, because the evidence is real clear and widespread across various iwi, various rohe, that they all did basically the same thing. So you can look at this and choose what to draw on for your whānau and whakapapa and carry that change on. Some whānau also perhaps have gone through a reflective journey of their challenges and things already, and they come in already having those glimmers and threads of thought. Like one kaihamahi who came through and her grandfather had been an awful drunk, and whenever he'd get home from the pub, someone was going to get a lashing because he would always just come home angry. And her father didn't want that, and so he never laid a hand on them, but he still held that anger. He hadn't managed to work that out, and so he instead lashed out with his words. And she's like, but now us tamariki, we've gone through the step change again. So we are now all much more emotionally in control and have developed those skills, so then we don't live in that anger like our father did, like our grandfather did. And so it's taken 3 generations, but now their tamariki are experiencing a much more, mana enhancing and gentle and loving upbringing. And so it's been a journey, but it's been a journey through generations on that reflection. So the changes can happen in lots of different ways for whānau. We've seen lots of different stories of how it can happen. And so we just try to tautoko those who join the waka and learn about this mātauranga for the first time and are asked to reflect. And it's kind of like, you can reflect, and then we need to look forward. And you can choose then from your reflections, what are you going to bring forward and weave into, the kākahu of your parenting way. And you can choose what to weave in and what to leave behind. Yeah.
It's beautiful, very very empowering. I remember we had a whānau wānanga, I've been 2009, Alan was there, and we talked about, because that was the smacking, that section, whatever it was, debate, and talking as a whānau, do we want to end smacking? But interesting, even within ourselves, there was some largely supportive, but there were also those who said, oh, well, it was good for me, it's not a problem. And then some who'd actually been traumatised by others in the whānau, were like, well, this is just hypocritical having this conversation. We haven't addressed it, within our whānau. But still, the opportunity for whānau, don't have to be, and I don't say this at all glibly, but we don't have to be captive to our histories, we can, and that's why it's beautiful, like a program like, Ngāko Aroha can empower whānau to find a new way for themselves. It's just beautiful. What do you see, as the outcome of this? So you run this program with parents, with those who work with whānau. What do you see down the line? What are you hoping will be the fruits of this work? Not just metrics, like what's the...
Kia ora. Well, I guess I still speak to that North Star that I mentioned at the beginning. Probably need to come up with a Māori whakaaro for that.
Or East Star, whatever.
Ka pai. That I'd love to be able to ask, if you ask anyone in New Zealand about, if you ask anyone in Aotearoa what was Māori parenting like before colonisation, that they should be able to say, oh, it was really gentle, wasn't it? Like, that should be our new normal. We've got a lot of stereotypes to unpick. Mainstream media, of course, Once for Warriors and Boy have been some of the most popular international exports in recent decades, and unfortunately don't speak to wonderfully wholesome whānau situations. And so people believe that. That at an international level might be harder to unpick in the long term, but we worry about Aotearoa, we worry about here, and unpicking that stereotype here, even if that is some whānau's truth growing up. It's kind of like, ka pai, we can acknowledge that, but we're just getting started on this journey, so let's all try to undo that. So that Easter, if everybody knows that truth, that Māori were gentle parents, that the tapu and the mana of Pepe and Tamariki was acknowledged in every day and every moment, like you say. What is a day but a many moments, many experiences all built up together. And if in each moment we're being gentle, protective and kind and loving, then that's a wonderful journey. And then I guess there's also that bigger view of, we're going to jump into a space, equity. There are lots of programs across the motu, but the most prevalent parenting programs are international. Incredible Years, Triple P, wonderful programs, but not New Zealand. Building Awesome Whānau, also amazing. I contributed a couple of videos to it as well because I believe in what they do, but also not kaupapa Māori. And so here we talk about the challenges that whānau Māori face, and without being metrics about it, but there's no investment in kaupapa Māori parenting programs of a scale. Lots of services, but yeah, I feel like there's gaps in the system. That's just picking one. That there needs to be a bit of a systems change, that if we're trying to really shift the dial for whānau Māori, for all whānau, but in our kōrero for whānau Māori, then having a Māori approach to those solutions in all spaces is probably going to be most useful, practical, relevant. It might not work for all whānau, but it would be better than, it might be better than what we're doing now.
Well, and you have a strong evidence-based approach, right? You've had studies conducted on your work, you've had impact assessments on your work, and they are glowing, so it's not like you're just, saying this on a whim and on a kind of just kōrero, like you've got evidence to back up what you're saying as well.
So our Ngāpuhi journey has had a social return on investment analysis, and the evaluation was really glowing with wonderful outcomes for the kaimahi themselves and for the whānau they support. Of course, including a deeper understanding of parenting, tupuna parenting practices, confidence with their parenting, less stressful family situations, whānau situations, more respectful whānau relationships, and this is the vast majority reporting this as a change for them, and also better child behaviour and tamariki well-being was also one of our outcomes. So our kaupapa has, and this is with the engineering portai always been firmly in place, but we've always been very data-driven, and like you said, capturing that feedback. All those early cohorts of this kaupapa, we surveyed a lot, and every time I read every one and would make adjustments and adaptations to the journey. So now we have this really impactful, effective, supportive journey, and it's a 20-week journey, and our graduation rate's 75%, and it's because we continue to tweak and support and change. So then we give our kaimahi who join this waka the best chance to complete the journey, because wonderful to get them into the kaupapa. I need them to graduate so then they can actually be useful for the movement. So if I'm really focused on that East Star and awareness and spreading this kaupapa across the motu, I need graduates. I need them to know the mātauranga well and know how to share it and weave it into the mahi they do, reframing their Western whakaaro they may have learned through their health and social welfare degrees and everything else, and diplomas and whatever else. Yeah. And so, yes, we come from a place that is, evidence-based, evaluated, data-driven, results-driven, because we're trying to not just turn the dial a little, we're trying to make a significant shift. We're trying to grow awareness in the biggest way. And all these graduates also can deliver whānau wānanga in their rohe to Ropu. So we've got a 8-week kaupapa that they can deliver to share this mātauranga with whānau and support them on their journey. And the reason this pivot to professional development rather than whānau wānanga ended up being so winning is because these kaimahi in health and social welfare and wherever they work, community leaders and others, they develop trusted relationships with the whānau they support. So they whanaunatanga and getting to know those whānau on an individual basis as part of the mahi they do. But it also means that they can then choose the best mātauranga that is going to click most with this whānau. What's going to really make this make sense for them? What's going to really support them that your toddler is not being naughty? They're learning and growing and exploring. They're embodying Maui in the mahi they do every day. And Maui was a hero of our people, but he was also cheeky and would make mistakes and didn't always go about things the right way, hiding in his brother's waka because he wanted to go on the fishing trip. But if he hadn't hidden in that waka, he wouldn't have pulled up Te Ika Maui. And getting our whānau to see Maui in the toddler that's pulling the plant out of the pot plant. It's kind of, that's frustrating. But that is also our mātauranga embodied. It's he, she, whoever. It's just being a toddler. It's being a little Maui in your whare. And so getting our graduates to be able to choose the best mātauranga that will support the whānau in front of them and give them tools and ideas and being open-minded about how to prevent situations, not necessarily focus on trying to reprimand or discipline. It's kind of like that whakaaro, you always have to come back to the teach. Yes, they've just poured the bottle of milk out into the sink, and that's frustrating because they didn't put the lid on. Yelling at them now is probably not going to fix the problem. But if you can instead be understanding and thoughtful and like, you need to put the lid on, my darling, and having their, kind of kōrero, then that lesson will still go in because they probably have whakamā and they're probably embarrassed about the mistake they've made. We need that milk, my girl. Anyway, it's, it's a big journey. The graduates are so important for the mahi we do to engage whānau and to spread this kaupapa across the motu. And my rōpū and I are just trying to enable that growth, support the scale of the kaupapa and give the graduates everything they need to be able to share more and do more in the rohe where they are.
Kia ora. I think one of the genius parts of Ngākau Aroha is that its ability, that it's predicated on the distinctiveness of rohe, of whānau, of experience. It's not saying all Māori with this, and this is the Māori. Like you're saying, we've got a lot in common, and the Maui stories, and there are others that we could, generally, we can share a lot of that. But looking for that story, hopefully somewhere that whānau can connect with, they can own their own story, and that's so powerful. For us, whether it's, Ngāti Kuta Patukia, in the north, or the Ngutiwawa, our whānau at the Waipu Valley, at the mouth of the river, having the distinctiveness of our story. But we also have our own pain and loss. So just in the kind of final thought from you, what's your hope for our whānau? Where do we need to be? Where do you see we can be as a whānau?
Where do our whānau need to be? Really does come back to seeing the mana na tapu in each of us. We see it in each other as Pākeke all the time, ne? Mm-hmm. But actually seeing it in our little ones, in the ririki as well, it's kind of, that's really special. And just by having that reframe that Tamaiti has mana. That Tamaiti will be a rangatira one day if we can support them on their journey. I think if we can support that reframe and that whakaaro and getting whānau to just take that pause and take that breath before they respond to any moment and think about the tapu and the mana. Let's try that again there, Tamaiti. Let's try and do something differently, ne? Try and do something differently together. I think even with those moments, it'll create a wave of change. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. It starts with lots of little things to hopefully create a really big wave.
I don't know what a marathon or a sprint is, so that's fine. But it's an analogy, I'm sure. Any last kōrero?
I guess tamariki wellbeing, I've seen the phrase kind of, people have been asking again. I just saw it on LinkedIn again this morning. That we seem to have lost a bit of our focus on tamariki wellbeing. And I think that does need to be really central to any mahi we're doing in health and in social. And it's not just about atinana, of course, but the emotional and the whānau and the spiritual wellness of our tamariki as well. I think that's important for all of us. And with the mahi that we do, we focus so much on pepe and tamariki. And I think making sure that's at the forefront. But also remembering to be kind and loving to yourselves. It's kind of like this parenting journey is hard. My tamariki are 5, 7 and 9. I'm in the thick of it in these young, busy, emotional stages with our young ones. But it's hard, and that we just need to be kind. And that we'll get there. Mm-hmm. As a people, we'll get there. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Well, kia ora, Liz. It's been such a pleasure to spend some time with you today, to listen, to hear, to share, and hopefully the whānau at home have lots to think about and lots to act on. And we'll put links to your mahi in YouTube and in other places as well. So kia ora. But just wishing you every blessing on your journey, and I might just finish with a short benediction if that's all right. Nō reira, toitu te rangi, toitu te whenua, toitu te aroha o te atua, toitu ona manaakitanga kei rungi a tātou katoa. Mauri ore e te atua, matua tama wairua tapu. Āmine.